So tonight I am delighted to welcome Tracy Rosenthal, Stephanie Bastek, and Rob Wohl, celebrating the release of Abolish Rent, How Tenants Can End the Housing Crisis. From two co-founders of the largest tenants union in the country, this deeply reported account of the resurgent tenant movement centers poor and working class people who are fighting back, staying put, and remaking the city in the process. Authors Tracy Rosenthal and Leonardo Vilchis take readers to trilingual strategy meetings, raucous marches against gentrification, and daring eviction defenses where immigrants put their lives on the line. These are the seeds of the revolutionary movement we need to make our housing, our cities, and the world our home. Tracy Rosenthal is a co-founder of the LA Tenants Union, whose writing has been published in The New Republic, The Nation, LA Times, and other outlets. Rosenthal is now on rent strike in New York City. Rosenthal will be in conversation with Stephanie Bastek and Rob Wohl, core organizers with Stomp Out Slumlords, which since 2017 has supported dozens of rent strikes against slumlords, shady developers, and unjust rent hikes from Ward 1 to Ward 8 and occasionally Maryland. Stephanie mentors nascent tenant unions across the country through the Housing Justice Commission of the Democratic Socialists of America, and Rob is an organizer for Unite Here Local 25. Stomp Out Slumlords is an affiliate of the Autonomous Tenants Union Network. So please join me in welcoming to Politics and Prose, Tracy Rosenthal, Stephanie Bastek, and Rob Wohl.
Thanks for being here, everyone.
Yeah, thanks for coming.
Thank
Hi.
you.
So you might have guessed I'm Rob. I appreciate the introduction that I didn't actually hear. But yeah, it's really exciting to be here and to be talking about Abolish Rent with Tracy. The LA Tenant Union is in my opinion, represents one of the most important social movements and just movement organizations in the country. It's been a huge inspiration for the work that we've done in DC. The book talks a bit about we'll come back around to it, but it talks about the Mariachi rent strike in 2015. And I had related to tenant politics before then. I was aware of the concept of a rent strike, but it was transformative for me personally to see that there were people actually doing it and winning. And I think that's the story of the LA Tenant Union, that they have done things and won things that most people in the world of community organizing and left-wing politics just didn't think were possible before they went out and did it. So it's an awesome conversation to be having. And yeah, so Tracy, thanks for coming to DC. My first question is, what brought you into this? What brought you to the world of tenant organizing? And what started your journey that led to this book?
Thank you, and thanks everyone for being here, and thanks Stomp Out Slumlords. We admire you from the West Coast, and appreciated when you came to visit us at the convention 2 years ago. That was wonderful, and it's really great to be in conversation with you all. So I know that your model is talking about stories, so I'll tell mine, which is the only reason why I'm here, the only reason why I'm writing this book is because I was organized. There's a couple other ways to put it, right? One is God. I just happened to be in the right place at the right time. I was connected to an artist-run space in Los Angeles where I happened to wake up the morning of the first School of Echoes meeting, which became a research project of artists, community organizers, teachers, asking their communities, what are you hearing? What's going on? And this was 2012 in Los Angeles, and to set the scene, if everyone can go back a decade plus two, it was really the start of conversations around gentrification. And what we were seeing, what communities were experiencing, was displacement and was rising rents. In Frogtown, half of neighborhood properties had changed hands in only 2 years. In Hollywood, Needle Exchange was really trying to catch up with stepped up encampment sweeps. tenants. In Boyle Heights, there were new police patrols and a new gang injunction in Echo Park, which criminalized youth of color simply for existing together outside. And this was the context through this, what we called research, but in many ways was reading, but it was also listening. And it, I learned through this research process about what people in my community, people in communities all around the city were experiencing. And we tried as a collective to come up with a way of understanding gentrification politically, to understand its agents, to understand its beneficiaries, and to understand what we could do to stop it. We didn't just want to define it, although I do think that our definition, displacement and replacement of the poor for profit, attempted to clarify what Neil Smith called the back to the city movement of capital rather than people. But we wanted to intervene in this process. And so, we asked in this context of the agents of gentrification, there were, the obvious ones, landlords, real estate developers. There was also politicians collaborating with those actors, and there was police. And at the same time, controversially, right, there were tenants themselves. Tenants who didn't know their rights, tenants who didn't recognize that they could fight back, that would, who would move, who would give up. And we wanted to create an instrument where tenants could come together as political actors to change the balance of power in that system. And so that is the formation of the Los Angeles Tenant Union, a thing that I had no idea I was going to be involved in when I woke up that morning. And so in a certain way, right, the answer is God. In a certain way, the answer is vengeance. I grew up in New York City, where the real estate capital real estate capital moved and then bankrupted my family from having like a business and in the music business, and it's also that I was organized. I had mentors, including my co-author Leonardo Vilchis, who throughout this process that I just described of School of Echoes, would sit me down, ask me questions, and it's only retroactively that I understand these coffees as one-on-ones, right? I had no idea what was happening to me at the time, but I remember one really specifically where Daunt Ryan, who's one of the founders of ACT UP LA and a member of School of Echoes and one of the founders of the Los Angeles Tenant Union, took me out and asked me, we've been doing this for a while, what do you think we should do next? And I said, well, you guys could, I don't know, think about this, or maybe you should meet with XYZ. And he just said, you've been with us this whole time. Isn't it time you start saying we? And so that is a moment that I reflect on in being hailed as a participant in this process. And there's and through that long engagement with this group of people who invested their time in me, I was organized and sticking around the movement for, it's going to be 10 years of the LA Tenant Union this summer, which is really exciting. And so I feel, I think it's, I think it's really important when we talk about organizing to recognize that we're always trying to replace ourselves. So even if I have the skill of writing, where one of my mentors, Walt Centerfit, who used to organize in SNCC, the Student Nonviolent Coordinating Committee, until he moved to Los Angeles and organized hospitals, he gave me a copy of Spinworks, and I never gave it back. I still have it on my shelf. I'm sorry, Walt. But I reflect on the fact that every skill can be an organizing skill, and that we're always trying to, do the work of replacing ourselves. So it just so happens that I'm here, but in a way, I could be anybody.
Yeah, I can definitely relate to that. I too was organized into doing this. That's the reason why I'm up here, is because Rob one day in 2017 was like, have you heard about this tenant organizing thing we're going to try to do? And back then it was canvassing. We were just doing anti-eviction canvassing. So in DC, back in the day, you had to go to the courts and you had to go physically print out a list of all of these addresses. And then thank God it was then put online. But we'd find these lists of people who had evictions coming up and go and let them know their rights, that they could contest it and show up, because most people's eviction cases just default to them being in the wrong, losing their case, getting an eviction filed against them because they didn't show up. And we had an impact there. And then gradually over the course of a year, we shifted into doing building organizing, and then we shifted again and accelerated. And during COVID, especially in 2020, we had launched our first rent strike in December of 2019, but in 2020 it just took off. At one point we had 3 dozen rent strikes across the city. It was wild. It was a very heady time, but that's a big evolution for us. And so I'm wondering, in the course of your decade with the LA Tenants Union, how has your strategy and your vision changed since 2015?
Yeah, that's a great question. I mean, I think that, one of the things that we learned really quickly in Los Angeles, right, a city of 9 million people, where it takes an hour and a half to drive across town, is that we could not have a single meeting space for our membership. It just could not be possible. So, having developing local chapters happened fairly quickly, but was a really big moment in our strategy, which I think, we can think about in taking place on 2 axes, right? There's the struggle that we have with our landlords. There's the work that we do on the building level to organize people with the same landlord, to fight that struggle, at the level of that class war, right? But then there's also the community building that we do at the level of our neighborhoods. And the local chapter is an instrument where, those 2 things can be coordinated, but they happen simultaneously. So I think that part of our strategy that has developed over time is, first of all, just to say a tenant union is the instrument that we have for tenants to socialize political risk, to socialize their experiences of being wronged by this housing system that is an unhousing system that is designed not to provide the most housing to the most people, right, or the best housing to the most people, but to extract the most profit and produce the most rent, right? So a tenant union, a tenant association, is the instrument that we have to fight back against that system at the level of our landlords. But it's also a way that we can build communities of defense, that we can create, we can claim the territory of the city. And so I think that having the local chapters emerge as a form, and so now I think we have about 12, and they operate fairly autonomously from each other, which gives people a lot of flexibility to respond to their local conditions. I'm sure, which are, patterned by historic forms of residential segregation, historic forms of abandonment, and new new investments. So what works in the low-slung neighborhood of Northeast LA wouldn't necessarily work for our new downtown local where we're organizing in SRO, single-room occupancy hotels. And so I think giving people a lot of autonomy has been like really important to our strategy and to, shaping how we do things long-term to think about that second access, right? Like, I think that it's, we think about a tenant movement and the tenant union as the struggle against landlords, but it's also, for us, it's really a struggle about claiming the territory of the city, about managing our own resources, about creating the democratic structures that we are, that we lack in this society where participation happens like once every 4 years with a vote. And so thinking about that local level and really deepening the practices that we have at that local level for to engage in things that, from one perspective, don't necessarily seem like they're aiding a direct struggle against a specific landlord, right? Like when we have movie nights in the backyard of one of our tenant associations, or where we do food distribution, or where we, clean up the alleys of a neighborhood, when we demand crosswalks or bus stops, or like bus benches for bus stops. I think that these are really, this is part of the infrastructure that we're creating as we grow our strategy along these two axes.
So I'm interested in the question of how you guys settled on the tenant organization and specifically the tenant union as the form to engage in all these different struggles. And as you say, we love to tell stories. So, the development of Stomp Out Slumlords, was, it was in part, it happened because of the blow up of the DSA 7 years ago, and people just looking for ways to engage in their community more. But a few of us who started the project had been trying different things over the years and responding, one thing that LA and DC definitely share is just an intensification of gentrification over the last, 20 to 30 years. And, I have been involved in a number of ways to try to respond to gentrification in the general sense that there was a housing crisis. And during the Occupy period, there was a group trying to do anti-foreclosure activism, direct action resistance to foreclosures. After that, I was involved in various projects, sort of cultural projects, trying to respond to what in retrospect I think are kind of the surface level aspects of gentrification, around the first wave of the Black Lives Matter movement, I think it took on a very racialized character in terms of just how do we think about how different racial communities interact, which is not a bad thing to think about, but I think personally, it wasn't really until I got evicted. I had been through a period of just intense personal instability, ended up in a group living situation with a community that I really valued, and then a few months after we got there, we got kicked out. The landlord illegally just told us we were going to move out, showed us the paperwork of how she was going to kick us out, and then we just left. We left without asserting any of the procedural rights we had as tenants. We didn't even let her take us to court. It seemed like a big pain in the ass. And so rather than go through that, we took some money, we moved on. And the situations we moved on to were, everyone landed on their feet, we're not the real victims, but it did reconceptualize how I thought about my role and the fact that, I do have this, I have this identity as a tenant, and even me as a, college educated, professional class, middle class white guy in DC, where it's in a city where, the idea, there's a truth to the fact that there's people like me displacing the people who are the real victims. I was still being caught up and victimized in my own way by this system. And that I think that experience made me really want to think about like how we could organize tenants as a class and build unity between people who, experience different severity when it comes to the housing crisis. Certainly, there's a lot of variable experience, but all share a common interest in legal protection and just making real the formal rights that the law affords us. But it took, for me, it took over, just like a lot of tries and some painful experiences to settle on like tenants as a class and to start to understand like just fighting back against the daily depredations of being a renter. Mm-hmm. So I'm interested, you talked about how the School of Echoes went out to investigate the community, and I'm curious like what you heard, what you saw, and just like what patterns that you saw in your city made you think tenant unions, that's the way to go, that's how we're going to fight gentrification, that's how we're going to change society.
Well, I think, yeah, and to be clear, like I love telling stories, or I wouldn't have written a book. And I think reflecting on what you said, right, like the two co-authors, like I think in many ways we reflect the kind of growing constituency of tenants in the United States. Millennials who can no longer, who are no longer able to afford to buy a home without having generational wealth, and people of color who have been for generations shut out of that like American property regime, right? And so I think that I think that when we look at who's present in our movements, that's often who we find. I can get more specific and say that in the LA Tenants Union, I often characterize us as like the abuelas and the LGBTs, but that is like, and that has to do with like specific forms of social reproduction, right, that are under crisis. But I think, to go back a little bit and talk about the prehistory of the union, which is the destruction of the Pico Aliso public housing projects, the largest public housing projects west of the Mississippi, that was in Boyle Heights. It was the defeat of that public housing that my mentor and co-author Leonardo was involved in fighting back against. And in their struggle, they managed to win the right of return for 250 families. But the rest of the community, right, like wasn't improved by the Clinton Hope 6 scheme of affordable housing replacing public housing. They were removed, and they found themselves in the private housing market. And so I think that defeat and the organization that was formed around, the residents of public housing who wanted to remain in that housing, and who struggled to for a right to return. And that defeat that was specifically under a Democratic administration, right? This is a Bill Clinton project using the housing policy developed by Reagan in his tax cut plan, right? Like LIHTC as an addendum to Reagan's tax cuts is now the largest source of quote unquote affordable housing in this, like for the federal government in this country. And so I think that history really animated a way of thinking about, what is it that the poor in Los Angeles are struggling for to have a place. And I think that, Los Angeles in 1984 was named the homeless capital of America, and we still boast the most unsheltered people in the country. And so I think that the combination of, being in this one-party city, in this one-party state, in the 5th largest economy in the world, where we still have the most number of unhoused people. I think that was really a challenge to reckon with the fact that the forms of governance that we have are not capable or interested in meeting the needs of poor and working class people. And thinking about ways that we could build power ourselves. And I think some of it also came from, I think some of it came from recognizing that the constituencies, the populations that we were organizing don't have traditional employment, right? That this is the, gentrification is the solution to deindustrialization. And in that sense, the jobs that were there that could have been, where people could have been organizing at work are no longer there. And so where can people organize? Where do they have power, right? They have power in their homes. And so I think, when we think about what power do tenants have, right? We think about, we have our rent checks. We have our social relationships, our relationships to each other, our ability to share risk, to have the experience that we are not alone, to have the support of a community. And we have our bodies, right? We are staying put in the places that we live. And this is something that I think, so I've been on rent strike now for more than 2 years. My whole building, I moved back to New York, and this was an accident. Again, this was God. This was the hand of God that put me in this building filled with roaches and being illegally deregulated. I did not know when I moved in, but I really did not like the roaches. And but they're really good for organizing. I hate to say it, because if you have them, then everyone has them, and there's nothing better for organizing than a problem that everyone has. And so I think through that, I think that experience has really shown me even more, the power of simply staying put, right? When you're on rent strike, you're just simply claiming your right to a place. And we also see this, I think, most starkly when I was organizing an encampment at Echo Park Lake. And, really importantly, I think that context that I gave really affects our work. So when we talk about a tenant in the Los Angeles Tenant Union, we're talking about anyone who doesn't control their own housing, which includes people who live outside, right? So in the last chapter of the book, we talk about organizing with and alongside an unhoused community that had claimed Echo Park, and were, engaging in processes of sharing resources, of creating neighborhood safety, of building their own showers, having support networks and harm reduction to deal with the opioid crisis that's endemic to the entire country. And I think that that is also really showed me the power of occupation, right? What it means to claim space, what it means to claim territory. And I'm going to let you ask another question.
I mean, that's a great segue to my next question, which is about alleys. Because you talk about how the LA Tenants Union doesn't just operate in buildings in particular. You're interested in claiming space and claiming parts of the city that tenants are denied control over. And I think one of the greatest stories for me in the book was the story of the tenants who reclaimed the alley by their building.
Yeah. I can tell that story, yeah. So this is as a part of, I'll just start from the beginning. So one of the tenants who was tangentially connected to a neighborhood committee in the Union de Vecinos East Side Local of the Los Angeles Tenant Union, got out of his car one night in an alley and was brutally beat up, and ended up in the hospital. People looking for money, or it really ultimately was unclear. And the community decided, in response to this very traumatic event, what are we going to do about this? And they talked about it, and I mean, the experience of calling the police that I'm sure a lot of people have is that they can come, they can make a situation worse. They can't heal a wound. They're not going to pay for your hospital bills, and most often they're not going to solve the problem that's endemic to the community. And so they, instead of focusing on the people, they focused on the space, right? They looked around and they were like, well, what is this alley? Like, well, first of all, it's pitch black. Second of all, it's covered in trash. And, you know, they appointed themselves as the caretakers of this place. And, you know, first they, you know, they did like a neighborhood cleanup where they just dragged all of the trash out of the alley, you know, into the dump. They, you know, and then of course, you know, like if a space is used in a particular way, that habit is hard to break, right? So they did this cleanup like every week. It was like a real commitment to invest their time in this space. And over time, you know, that's the kind of habit that takes hold, that suddenly people were getting in trouble for dropping trash. They were like, I'm gonna tell my aunt on you, like you can't do that. And suddenly more members of the community, like you know, young men in the community were like, I can't let these like abuelas like carry these large objects like and stand here, it's embarrassing, right? So then more people get involved in this process, and slowly over time, what you have is like, is a space that's clear. And the women in the community were like, well, what do we do now? Let's use the space. So they held movie nights for kids, and they strung string lights and ran the electricity out of an apartment window and brought a projector. And, you know, you know, I think one of the members that we talked to, right, she was like, I remember this one person who was like, you know, clearly in a gang, like, just like, what are you doing here? Like, you guys can't be here. And she was like, well, like, we're just going to do it tonight, right? Like, we're just going to have this one night. And then, like, by the third one, those are the guys who are clearing the streets and redirecting traffic and making the space safe for it to be used. And so this process of creating a usable space for creating collective commitment to the places that we live, I think it's like a really, I think for us, it's a really powerful example of like what we can do to create safety with our own resources and with our own intentions. And of course, you know, by building this authority over the space that you take up, they're also able to then extract concessions from the state, right? So now the alleys are lit with streetlights, but that wouldn't have been possible through the, you know, regular complaint process. It was by appointing themselves as the authorities of the neighborhood, creating these networks of safety and community, that then they had the authority to make those demands. And so I think that, you know, again, this is one of the ways that we think about a tenant union as a way to rebuild the social fabric that's like broken down by gentrification, by policing itself, and like a way that we think about, you know, like making demands of the state. And I think that relationship is really, clear in that story.
So the thing I really love about this book is just all the organizing stories. And, you know, like I've followed the LA Tenant Union over social media and, you know, talked to you guys at the convention a couple years ago, but like it was really interesting to learn the details of a lot of these things. I encourage people to read the book, but I do want to circle back to the Mariachi's rent strike. Because I think that kind of was a watershed it sounds like it was a watershed for LA Tenants Union. And just mechanically, that kind of means it was a watershed for the United States tenant movement. So can you talk about what happened in the course of that struggle and what kicked it off?
Of course. So this was a 26-unit building in Boyle Heights, a historic Chicano neighborhood, 2 blocks from Mariachi Plaza, which, if you don't know, was named in the 20s for the practice of mariachi musicians going down to the plaza to pick up work, which they still do to this day. And this building, a third of the the residents were mariachi musicians, and the majority of the tenants had lived in this building for 10, 20, if not 30 years. A new landlord bought the building right at Thanksgiving, and by Christmas was handing out rent increase notices, some up to $800 a month. And I think it's important to remember, right, like a rent increase notice of $800, like, was perfectly legal. It's market rate building. You can charge whatever the market, not the tenants, can bear. And these are not evictions, technically, right? These are polite evictions. They are not recorded as evictions. They're not recorded as displacements. But of course, if you get a $800 rent increase that you can't afford, that is precisely what's happening. And the tenants were obviously, in many ways, as we all are, like terrified, frustrated, like in disbelief that this could happen to them, and that, according to their council member, according to legal services, there was nothing that they could do. But they they had heard about the tenant union, and they came to a meeting where they heard about another rent strike, an earlier rent strike, that was in the same local chapter. And they decided, they didn't decide to go to straight up withhold their rent right away, right? The first thing that they did as a building was simply try to demand a meeting with their landlord. They wanted a face-to-face meeting with the man who was now capable of putting them all out on the street, effectively putting them out of their neighborhood. And they didn't even know this person's name. So they first had to figure out who it was, right? Like a research project that ended up with, members of the union knocking on doors pretending to sell chocolates, right? Like, this is what it takes. There are so many systems that have been put in place to protect our landlords from the accountability, and to protect our landlords from us, basically. So naming that person, trying to get a meeting, was really their first step. But that didn't work. He didn't come to the table. He didn't even respond. Like, he didn't even write a letter. He just sent more rent increase notices. And, the tenants, they decided, they started meeting every week. And they decided, well, what if we go to the property manager? And they held a protest outside of the property manager's office, who said, oh, I'm powerless over this. The decision is the landlord's. Again, they held a bigger action in Mariachi Plaza, trying to get the whole community involved. They tried to bring in the council member. They went through, a lot of the direct action media strategies that we have that we think of as a part of a classic pressure campaign, and nothing worked. And so I think for some of the tenants who couldn't afford the rent increases, they realized, well, we have nothing left to lose. What if maybe he won't listen to our words, but he will listen to the money not entering his bank account, right? Our money will speak louder than our words. And they, they were able, through weekly meetings, through creating this community in their building, through engaging the larger support of the union, not only were the tenants who couldn't afford the rent increases decided to go on strike, but they brought in their neighbors in their building who could have afforded the rent increases, but decided to, in solidarity, right, to defend that community that they built in the building, and that they recognized across Boyle Heights. They decided to withhold their rent. And so through that process, an almost year-long strike, and of course, with that economic sanction against their landlord, and a bit, with the escalated direct action of camping out on the landlord's lawn. We say in the union, like eviction, displacement, rent increases, these are personal for us. They should be personal for our landlords too. So combining the raising the social cost to the landlord and depriving him of the resources of almost a year of rent, the combination of those two things brought the landlord to the bargaining table, and that building was able to negotiate a bargaining agreement that is basically the equivalent of rent stabilization for their building. And they also signed, in that agreement was the right to renegotiate, which they've now done a few times. And each time, because that agreement has rent tied to the conditions of their homes, they've really invented a lease that is in many ways better than any lease that tenants across the city of Los Angeles have access to. We quote James Boggs in the book, rights are what you make and what you take. And I think that story for us really animates, what are the rights that can be claimed through collective organizing, through tenant power, through our coming together in units of power, in building associations, and making demands of our landlords ourselves. And so I think, that really was a formative moment for the union around what's possible, and how we as a movement could appoint ourselves as the agents of this political struggle, and of this political struggle to transform our housing system and the society that we live in.
I did have another question for you, Tracy, but
Okay.
I want to leave 15 minutes for the audience to ask questions. And if you guys don't come up with any good ones, then I'll ask Tracy my questions. Okay. But that was just such a great note to end on.
Yeah.
So, the floor. Yes.
Hi. Ooh, loud. I'm from Los Angeles, so thanks for sharing your DC organizing space with me today. My first LA memory is 2011. There's snipers silhouetted in City Hall looking over Occupy. That is the dominant image of power in DC. I imagine there are many iconic similar images. Our mayor just appointed a new head LAPD who thinks that the problem is that we're not calling LAPD enough. He was appointed in October, and that's the first headline about him. So I don't think we can look at our existing institutions to save us, right? But being in LA for Occupy and for multiple waves of Black Lives Matter and for pro-Palestinian organizing recently, we just watch the movements kind of get co-opted over and over again. And I know Kansas City Tenants Union is having a huge benefit that many celebrities will be at tomorrow night. Mm-hmm. So I feel with your book coming out and a bunch of different things, tenant organizing is mm-hmm. going over the hill to become more vulnerable than ever to that same kind of co-option. What are the things you're kind of mm-hmm. Keep an eye out.
Thank you. Do you want to take a few at a time?
Yeah.
Yes. Thank you for that. I'll think about that. And then I'm going to ask you guys a question.
Thank you so much for coming. Really appreciate it. I was curious about the political processes you envision in the future and sort of what new institutions and what new ways of coming together we should envision. And how do we center community involvement without privileging the perspectives of the folks who can take time to go to those things and not lose working folks, parents, things like that?
Hi, I apologize. It's kind of a three-part question, but I was wanting to know what your feelings are about the role of political education in the process, what that looked like in the tenant union and how that was implemented in the tenant union.
Should we start there? Let's start there. So I think, to answer the last one first, we talk about our union as a school. And I think when we think about a union as a school, we're thinking about that from the recognition that everything that we do is an experiment. We don't know how we're going to transform the power relations that we're in, that has made the economic system that has made owning a home earn more money than working an average job, right? Like that is the economic system we're in. We're the economic system where our former mayor, Eric Garcetti, can say, in a good economy, homelessness goes up, right? And where, housing in particular is like implicated in so many systems of, of racialized inequality and population control, right? Like if we think about jails and prisons as our most expensive form of public housing, that is actually just as expensive as private asset ownership, right? That are it's $200 billion in subsidies to private homeowners and about $200 billion of public debt and taxes that go to prisons, right? And so this is the bifurcated housing system that we're in. And so I think that, to answer your question about co-optation, I think that one structure that we have implemented in the union is dues. And I think that dues are also an educational tool, right? Because when we appoint ourselves as the sustainers, as it's our job to sustain ourselves, right? The education that comes with that is that practice of autonomy. Do I think that necessarily means that we can't steal funding when it's available? I actually don't think that. And I'm less afraid. I think that in my experience of organizing in Los Angeles, I'm thinking about the Roslyn Tenant Association in downtown Los Angeles, where Karen Bass's Inside Safe program is literally evicting poor and working class people who in an SRO so that the SRO corporation can put unhoused people through the program called Inside Safe in those places, right? When I think about who we're organizing, I have a much harder time imagining that someone's really gonna come for that activity that is really, bad for Karen Bass's image, who is, probably I think, we can talk, whatever, but I'm just don't let me. But, she used to be a socialist, right? Yeah. So, she used to be a socialist, and now her reputation is writing on Twitter, 15 people used to live here in a picture of an empty sidewalk, right? Anyway, but I think for us, it's really about, who we're organizing. And to answer your question in that same way, I think that, I think that there are plenty of, interventions that we make in our unions. First of all, we hold our meetings in people's homes. And I think that's another thing that we changed at a certain point, that rather than asking people to come to a union space, we make people's homes the union space. And we also think about how, the union is a way of life. It's, it doesn't end when the meeting's over. It's the chairs go away and then there's a birthday party, and that is part of the project. And so I think that for us, building that community long-term, sharing the work of childcare. All of our meetings take place either in Spanish or they're fully bilingual. And that infrastructure is so important because that also, like, I think that we have an advantage in many ways over other tenant unions because we have a check on the, like, what I call the, like, but I'll go first. Like, I'll go first. Like, I came to your union meeting and I'll go first, right? There's like an instant check because monolingual English speakers are like suddenly in a space that is like actually more accessible if you are bilingual. And so I think that there are these interventions that we can make that actually make like Spanish language the dominant language of our movement and our union, that make, make people's homes the site of organizing so they're not having to travel, that think about those engaging people in those rituals. And, we think a lot about, I know that this is like California woo in some ways, but it's also like, thinking about, sharing food and breaking bread. And, like Leo was trained in liberation theology, and, I don't know what happened to, I don't know why I believe in God. I just have to. I just have to. But, I think that kind of process, that the MST would call mystica, is really also how we take care of people and move ourselves, like move the movement forward, rooted in the communities that we want to be rooted in. I didn't finish answering your question exactly, so now I'm going to do it. I think that I started this conversation by talking about School of Echoes. And again, something I didn't realize was like, echoes is a way of talking about listening, right? So when we think about organizing in the union, we're often thinking about organizing as a process of listening. And that is a way of thinking about political education as popular education, as informed by like problem posing and like people's self-driven activity. But also, so when we went through, we've gone through many sort of part of it is that, on the one hand, I think we can think about our organization as moving to claim territory. And then on the other side, it's like to create these spaces of assembly. And in those spaces of assembly, like reflection is so much of an important part of what we do. And when we ask people, like, what are we doing, right? We might get different answers than we would expect, like as organizers, we get like women organizing community defense was one of the main pillars that came out of our annual reflection, rather than like we're fighting for rent control even, and I think that that's something that then feeds back into the work that we're doing. Like, oh, right, okay, we're women organized, like they're women organizing community defense, right? Like that's something that we cultivate in our work. And so I think about that. I think about political education like as a process. And I think, to get away from that like banking model of like, I know how we're gonna do stuff. No, this is all a total experiment. Like anyone who says they know what they're doing is selling you snake oil. The thing that we have is like people's stories. And creating those spaces of assembly where people can share the things that worked so that we can grow together is, I think, I hope that answers your question.
On the question of co-option, I think the tenant struggle is an interesting one because it's already been co-opted. In DC in particular, we had a really great wave of tenant organizing in the 60s and 70s. That resulted in the writ of habitability we have. There were some heroic rent strikes. Like everything we do now, we owe to the folks in the 70s, and that got co-opted because a lot of those groups went on in a good way. Were funded by the government to help people navigate this new process. You have the right of the right to buy your home, but that requires funding. You have to pay people, and these nonprofits get set up, and so it was already co-opted in a way. And so the difference, I think, between the tenant unionism movement and that, and sort of organizing directed by very well-meaning people who work nonprofit jobs, is that is dues. I think it's dues, and it's modeling what we do on the labor movement and on like working in struggle together, and all of us being on the same page. You know, a rainbow coalition of people who are in the same class. We've only got a couple more minutes, so I'm gonna have to veto it.
We can shoot the shit after the talk.
Yeah.
I mean, I also think, like, notably, like, we think about, like, radical politics in America in the last few decades in terms of, like, these waves of protest struggle. And, like, I've been in those waves of protest struggle. And every single time I was in those wave of protest struggles, I was extremely excited and thought, the revolution is here.
Yeah.
And it wasn't. And, like, we hadn't built the power to be able to, you know, just to have, like, a continuing presence. And I think part of what happened to Occupy or Black Lives Matter was co-optation, and part of what happened was just dissipation. Nobody knew what to do after a certain period. You can only protest for so long. And so it's not just dues, like, we need to institutionalize our movements. And, you know, it's to some extent, I think that the labor movement, I mean, you know, I got introduced as an organizer for a local here. Like, I think we learned from the labor movement. Certainly, if you, like, I encourage people who are interested in tenant organizing to take a look at the SOS reports, because we talk about
Which
what
are
we
really
learned.
good.
We learned from
slumlords.org.
what we learned from the labor movement and about, like, how to do the process of organizing. But I also think we have a ways to go in terms of, like, we can raise money from membership, but that requires democracy. That requires institutionalizing certain processes. I mean, our primary self-criticism as an organization is that we are just frankly not democratic. And to answer your question, I mean, like, we are already in some sense a rainbow coalition, but I do think if we look around at a lot of the autonomous tenant unions, like, it would be fair to say that it is professional class white people who take a lot of the initiative. Not always, and certainly there are people are leading their own struggles in some sense, but, like, the intellectual, you know, it just is what it is. So yeah, I mean, like, we need to pursue genuine organizational democracy, membership, like, building from the foundation and trying to, and also being, you know, I think that relates to education. We need to, those of us who see ourselves as organizers, we need to, like, push people to really learn the work of organizational management and just taking, Tracy said that your role as an organizer is to replace yourself. It's a mantra that's really important, because we need to not just go from campaign to campaign. We need to train people to lead their campaigns. We need to, like, train people to actually have the ability to lead their own organizations and step up to the level of citywide leadership, so that we do have something that's more inclusive and democratic, and that's building towards, like, the, you know, the classless, racially egalitarian society we all want.
Thank you for the book. I found I found it at a very good time, so I, you know, really appreciated distilling it all, and yeah, hope I have things to update in the future. But my question I wanted to ask, you talk about, like, the relationship to the state and also the relationship to nonprofits, but more importantly, primarily, like, the state as, I think I'm paraphrasing, but, you know, building up the autonomous power, the community power, but while not becoming dependent upon the state and its resources, like, using it where you can, delaying the evictions process through lawyers, things like that. I guess my question to you is, especially over the next few years, and, you know, both within your city, but also all around the country, as the state itself is changing, and also to, like, some experience I've heard about with relation to, like, a former a council member who called himself an abolitionist and then was pushing, like, the Hillside Via Tenants Association to accept the really bad deal. I was wondering if you could talk about, like, how should organizers think about, like, the state as it relates to what they're doing, and especially over the next few years, something that, like, people want to become more independent from, or, yeah.
Thank you for that. Are we going to take other ones, or
Yeah, I think maybe the last round.
maybe last round?
You mentioned the deindustrialization, but was wondering, and I haven't read the book, what relationship you guys have with labor organizing of any kind.
Great question.
I was wondering if you have any thoughts on how to fight against landlords getting better organized with each other. I mean, the example that comes to mind for me is the company RealPage, setting rents for something like half of multifamily apartments in the country, and how to fight that.
Yeah, that's a great question. These are great questions. Thank you all so much. And now I'm really wishing that I had a co-author, to share the labor. You guys can help. I think, I've been really thinking a lot about your question more recently. And so I think that I have, I think I have a couple answers to it. And one is that the state is not one thing. When we think about, let's think about COVID, the state of emergency of the COVID pandemic, and what happened to tenants in that time. There was a state agency that came up with an eviction moratorium. That state agency was the CDC. And I think that tells us something interesting, right? Well, from the perspective of tenant organizers, it tells us that when we look at housing from the perspective of health, we have a really different kind of answer for what should happen to our housing, right? No one in a pandemic should be pushed out onto the streets when there is a pandemic raging and stay-at-home orders are in place. That CDC eviction moratorium was squashed by the judiciary, right? It was squashed by the courts, which have been the target of a long-term right-wing retrenchment. And the legislature came up with subsidies, right? Came up with subsidies to landlords, that is how they were going to deal with this crisis, right? The demand from the streets was to cancel rent. In Los Angeles, we organized Food Not Rent, and the state dealt with this crisis by basically pouring money into landlords. And so I think that, first, I think we should be clear, right, that the state has many parts, and that means it has many targets, and it's internally contradictory, and I don't think we do ourselves a service by necessarily assigning or pretending that it's one coherent thing. And I think that those internal contradictions are going to be even more important in the next 4 years, right? And at the same time, right, I think that there's maybe, one thing that I've been thinking about, and I can think specifically about it through Hillside Via, is a building in Los Angeles' Chinatown that's organizing in 3 languages and across 3 different forms of tenancy, one, and the main one being that affordable housing system, right? Those LIHTC, low-income housing tax credits that, supposedly produce affordable housing, but this is basically subsidies, temporary subsidies to landlords and temporary subsidies to developers, right? And so, their covenant ran out and they're organizing to stay put. And their demand is to expropriate the building from their landlord, right? And the way that they are organizing for this is by producing a crisis for the state. Right, and so this is sort of, I think, it's by producing our own authority, by organizing our building, then we also have the capacity to make demands of the state and also to produce crises for the state. And I think that that is a way of relating to the state that is not about, that's about extracting concessions. And I think about the role, that I think you're so right, everything that we rely on now that we call our rights are the wins of the historic tenant movement, are the concessions of the past, right? And so we think of what's gonna happen long term, it will have that same dialectical character. And I think that if we think strategically about how to produce bigger crises, we're going to be able to extract more concessions rather than, appointing someone as a council member who might call themselves an abolitionist and then change her mind when it becomes convenient, which it did, because LA City Council is a 15 body, 15 people governing a city of 4 million, right? That the pressure on that system is too great. So what are the power, let's think clearly about the powers that we have. I'm forgetting all the other questions. Oh, you asked a good question. You want to ask, do you guys want to answer the labor question?
Well, I mean, do you want to answer the labor question or should I? You can speak more freely.
Yeah, well, I think the question in particular is how you do it in LA. We're very explicit about we have a close relationship with labor in this city. We were trained in the pandemic by members of a local labor union who shall not be they're named Unite Here.
We put it on paper.
It's on paper already. And I think we do have there's a revolving door between corporations and government. We have a revolving door between labor and the tenant movement. I think for good, though, it's different. But I think we do have a close relationship. And I think the best part of it, though, is that for me at least, one of the most heartening aspects of organizing people as tenants, as a class, is that they start to see themselves as part of the working class and then can take that fight to their workplace and can take that fight to other places in their lives. And we have seen that. We have people coming out of organizing committees at their building and then putting that to work at their workplace, delegating the boss, joining labor unions, becoming organized workers in themselves and dues paying members of labor unions. So
I think I can actually answer these two questions at once, right? Which is to say that I think one of the ways to deal with the scale of landlord organization, right, is to think about how our struggles is to have more solidarity and to think about how we can access tenant struggle through the labor struggle. I think that I've been thinking, as we all have been, about the demand for divestment in this age of genocide and what our role is to split the resources that we have from the complicity in that genocide. And I think that that same tool of divestment is really important also to the tenant struggle. It's fascinating.
Just ignore that, yeah.
I'm it's fucking Mossad. Sorry, it's a terrible joke. I'm really sorry.
Sorry, C-SPAN.
Death to, etc.
They have a field office in the Atlantic building right above us. So
I was in the, I know we joked about this before, but the one time that I was written about in the Atlantic, I also ended up in the Manhattan Institute website. That was fun. But I think to think about divestment, specifically through the labor movement, right? It's the pensions, pension funds, for instance, are heavily invested in these real estate corporations that use RealPage software. Similarly, in universities, right? I reflect on the UC grad worker strike, the largest graduate worker strike in history, and they were organized around their rent burdens, and their university has 4.5 billion in Blackstone. To me, the power that they have as workers is greater than simply addressing their needs as workers and challenging, the role of the UC as an employer. It's also about challenging the role of the UC as a real estate speculator. And this too with pension funds and what they're invested in, that people's own savings, their own retirement savings, are being used by corporations that are ultimately displacing them. And so I think that thinking more broadly about how we can access these, about what tactics we have to access, that may not look specifically like the struggle in a building, but is about connecting our struggles together, is about recognizing that what power you have, in your workplace to make decisions about your pension funds changes my life as a tenant, right? And the power that I have to extract, to refuse money from my landlord might deprive resources from Israeli settlements. And I think that this, that as our enemies get more and more organized, it requires us to be more and more organized and to recognize the fact that, so much of, that all of our struggles are interconnected.
That would be a good point to leave it
Yeah, I
on,
think-
so
yeah.
let's stop there. If you want, so I think we're going to table for a second. You can get an autograph from Tracy. You can buy a Stomp Out Slumlords t-shirt or an
We'll
LA
sign your
Tenant Union.
shirts.
Or bedazzle them like Stephanie's.
Actually, yeah. Get that on TV.
If you're in DC and you're interested in learning more about this thing, we have a mailing list. You should sign up for it. We are happy to hang around and talk about ways to get involved in the organizing we're doing in DC. If you want, come hang out. It's my birthday celebration today, so you can come hang out at Lyman's Tavern.
Yeah, that's right.
After we get done here, I'll gladly talk about this stuff for as long as you want.
This was awesome. Thank you.
Thanks for
Oh,
coming,
thank you for
Tracy.
coming, Tracy.
Thanks for writing the book.
Thanks.